So back here we're breaking the chains, and we've done the first sort of cycle of turn 2. So turn 1 passed pretty uneventfully. We've just got into turn 2 and done the first cycle. The Chinese carrier Task Force 3, the carrier sent some planes up to try and attack this Tarantul missile boat in the Spratlys. Was intercepted by the F-35s flying off the Nimitz carrier here, and the Americans won that dogfight handsomely, shooting down all the Chinese fighters with no losses at all. The Chinese attempted to retaliate by flying all their fighters, the remaining fighters off the other two carriers, into Task Force 4 to attack an American destroyer, and they're one of these good Burt class carriers in there, and they got a really good roll, but so they would have sunk that unit, but it's at range 4 and that halved their combat values, so they didn't have any effect at all. Small margins here, so they weren't able to get any traction in terms of attacking. And so we're now coming into the second phase with the Chinese pushing forward and trying to get some coalition forces in range of their aircraft. Well, some real good fortune for the Chinese. The Americans decided that at some point they were going to have to take a chance to try and counteract the threats from all these carriers. We're just protecting the destroyers and frigates. There's just too much force moving towards them, and they launched an attack on Task Force 2 with the F-35s off the Nimitz, and they were intercepted by combat air patrol from the Daoyu carrier and the Liaoning carrier fighters flying support out of here. And the American F-35s did very well. That was their role in combat, 10 plus their air-to-air factors of 5, 15 against a defense of 12. That was enough to shoot down 2 steps of fighters off the Daoyu carrier. But then they got shot at in return by the remaining fighter group, and the Chinese rolled a 12, and that destroyed 2 steps of F-35s. And then as the F-35s went in to attack the ships in the group, they came under anti-aircraft fire from the Luoyang destroyers, and would you know it, they rolled another 12 doubles, and that destroyed the final step, and the F-35s never returned home. So the Americans and the First Island Coalition forces, who I think in this scenario face something of an uphill battle, are really in quite a lot of trouble now. The Chinese still have surviving air on one of their carriers at least. It's the furthest carrier out, but they have unopposed air remaining in the region, and they have this very potent combination of 3 destroyers covering 3 frigates, and that is a lot of surface-to-surface firepower that they can project out over. Certainly, it should be more than enough to force their way into 2 hexes of the Spratlys. The only other thing that happened this cycle was an attempt by the Vietnamese Kilo submarine here to hunt down these Chinese submarines. You can see the Chinese subs evaded quite comfortably. Didn't want any part of that, because the job of the Chinese forces is to occupy 2 of these hexes with units, 2 hexes of the Spratlys, and that sub is doing that without needing to fight. So he chose to evade instead of getting into what would essentially be a toss-up on the dice rolls. And I think someone else wants to play. You want to play as well? You got shy now. Now I'm pointing the camera at you. You're shy. Yeah. Okay. We've reached cycle 4 in turn 2 in this position with the 3 Chinese task forces lined up here. 2 American, First Island American stroke Vietnamese task forces here. Chinese sub down in the Spratlys down here. The Chinese have just won the initiative here and to define the first engagement, and pretty much anything they say they're doing will end up involving virtually all these forces. For example, if this group here were to announce an attack against these, then these could join in. So they may as well announce an attack with all these forces against these, and then these can join in, and we'll end up with all these groups firing at each other. That will still leave them the advantage of unfired ships up here in the first task force, although their planes failed to recover. But they have got 2, destroyer and frigate groups in there that could also fire. So they're likely to win this shootout simply because they've got more ships. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 surface combat ships, an aircraft carrier, against 1, 2, 3 good destroyers and some less good stuff. But we'll see how this all shakes out. So the Chinese are going to attack Task Force 1 with Task Forces 2 and 3 here. So running through an engagement, let's see if I can get this right. The first thing we'd do is any aircraft would trace strike paths, but both those carriers in these task forces have been shot down, and the aircraft on Carrier 1 are not recovered. As I said, all the F-35s are gone, so we've got no aircraft, no strike paths, no air-to-air combat. The next thing we'll do is surprise submarine attacks, and there's a we'll include this in the Americans will obviously include this in the forces that are going to take part in this combat. So this sub can make a surprise attack on something in this group, although I'm completely wrong about that. It can't, because the Americans and Vietnamese are not the side who are defining the combat. If you're the attacker, you can make surprise attacks with your submarines, but if you're the defender, you have to wait until much later in the sequence before you get to fire. So unfortunately that sub does not get to fire right now, because that would be tasty. So the next thing that happens is surface naval combat. So we conduct anti-ship strikes against targets within range in order of stealth scores. So the stealth scores for the Chinese surface units are 2, 2 and 2, and they have anti-ship ratings of 3, 3 and 3. In these groups we have 2, 2, 2, 2, 2 and 2. So we have 2s all the way across the board. Let's have a look at the anti-ship scores. 3, 3, 1, 3, 3 and 1. Okay, so the First Island chain have stealth 2, anti-ship 3 on 4 occasions, and stealth 2, anti-ship 1, and the Chinese in this instance only have 3 ships, and they've got stealth 2, anti-ship 3. So the anti-ship 3, stealth 2, anti-ship 3s are all simultaneous. So we'll start with the Chinese as the aggressors. In here they've got a frigate which will fire at a destroyer in here. It needs a 12 to hit. yeah, it needs 12s to hit, and it's rolling with a +3, so let's give that a go. And they've missed. We'll mark them. I'll grab some five markers so that we can see what it's fired. So that's the first one done. And then we've got a destroyer group and frigate that are going to do the same. They're going to fire at the same. Actually, no, they're not. They're going to fire at they're going to fire at the destroyers in here. So they'll roll a 7 + 3 is 10. But that from the frigate, an 11 + 3 is 14. Let's just mark those both up with a fire counter. So that is going to destroy the destroyers in Task Force 4, although they will get their shot because it's all simultaneous. So let's do that. Task Force 4 has got 2 units with anti-ships of 3. The first one will fire into Task Force 3 here at the destroyers in there. And we get a 7 and 10, that's no good. The second one gets a 10, 13. 13 beats the target number of 11 by 2, and that is the Russian destroyers gone. So I'll remove them from the board and the fire marker, and I can take the American destroyers off now and mark these up as fired. Okay, and then Task Force 1, they'll start by opening fire on the frigates in here, and they no longer have any. Well, no, I guess it's simultaneous. So I suppose they would still have the defense of the destroyers at this stage. So they're firing. I get an 11 and an 11. I'm not entirely sure whether, given that it's simultaneous, whether you should announce all your targets all at the same time, and if they're destroyed, well, too bad, or whether you get to pick new targets. No, I'm not too concerned about it, but it's just interesting, little wrinkles. Anyway, that is all the Stealth 2 anti-ship 3s fired, and all the casualties removed, which was I think a destroyer from each side. So what we've got now are Stealth 2 anti-ship 1, which are these Tarantar missile boats, and there's one in each of the task forces. So in Task Force 4 they will fire at the frigates in here in Task Force 2. And now the destroyers are gone because this is not simultaneous. So although their anti-ship is only 1, the target number for these attacks is 9. So let's see what they get. They've got a 6, that's terrible. And they'll also shoot at the frigates in the other task force. And a 3, that's not going to do anything. So let's mark these guys up as fired as well. and now it is the Americans' turn to define. Oh no, sorry, that was surface naval combat. Now we get anti-submarine combat, and the carrier in here, in Task Force 3, can try and engage this Kilo, which was so okay. Let's see how that goes. It gets a 5 plus its anti-submarine of 2. That's a 7. That's not going to work. No effect from that, and now we conduct gun strikes against things in the same hex. Well, there's none of those, and now we can conduct torpedo strikes. So the sub, with its torpedo factors of 3, will attempt to sink the Task Force 3 frigates, these ones here. They've got a target number of 8, and they're rolling 2 dice plus 3. They've got 5 plus 3 is 8, and they don't hit anything. So after some big high numbers, that all rather petered out into something of a damp squib. The subs stay there. In fact, the subs can have a fired marker because they've attempted to make a strike. And the reason you might need that is because it means they can no longer evade, but they're not going to need to this turn. And it's now it would now be the Americans to define a strike, but they've got nothing that can do anything, so it's now back to the Chinese. So they pass, and it's back to the Chinese, who've still got Task Force 1, and they are going to attack Task Force 4 here, and there's nothing that can be done about it. These guys have already fired. There's no support available, nothing in range anyway. So there's going to be 2 anti-ship strikes coming in here, both 3 strength. The first one into the Gepard frigate, and if we sink that, we'll then take on the missile boat. But let's see, the 6 plus 3 is 9. It has a defense of 9, so that's no effect. We'll attack it again. A 3 plus 3 is 6, has no effect either. And I think the coalition, the First Island Coalition, might be quite pleased with that sequence of events. I mean, just trading a destroyer, probably. I mean, it's not good enough for them to win, but it's not as catastrophic as I've seen in my past attempts to try and defend here. So that is probably it, since everything has now fired. I'm not going to mark the fire markers up because we're at the end of the cycle. So we'll just remove the fired markers from everything. It took a shot there, and I'll make a roll for the recovery of those planes. They get 2 dice plus 2 for having 2 steps. They get an 11, and they have recovered. They needed more than 8. Over on the this side, we'll remove those 5 markers there, and those 5 markers up there. And we're into cycle 5, and it's the Chinese to move. Well, I really can't remember what I filmed, to be honest, but we're in the 6th cycle, General Quarters cycle of turn 2, so after this there'll be 1 turn to go, and some combats to roll out here, depending on who wants to fire at what. So we've got the American task force down there with a carrier and the boat destroyers and a missile boat in it, and a second one up here which has got a missile boat, a destroyer and a frigate in it. And then you can see I've taken most of the Chinese task forces off the board now. They've got a sub there, frigate there, carrier with no planes there, frigate there, carrier with no planes here. So the only thing with planes on it is this task force here with a carrier, destroyer and some J-31s. So quick initiative roll to see who's going to define the contest. 3-2, so American first island to go first, and I'll work my way through this and come back. End of that cycle then, and a Chinese carrier was sunk, and some damage put into this frigate group for in return for no damage at all on the first island chain group, who are now in what looks like a very strong position. And I'm struggling to work out quite how this happened. Have to watch it all back, I guess. The Chinese forces look very, very strong, very strong, very strong, and then I think I probably made a terrible mistake in splitting them all up, although they'd lost their destroyers, and those are what provide you with, really good cover. And the American First Island group have got their destroyers in both of these task forces shielding, the rest of the ships in there, and also with a potent attack, 3 anti-ship. These guys are spread out, they've lost their destroyers. The only remaining destroyer is covering the carrier here, and the carrier, the planes launched an attack against one of the destroyer groups and missed completely, and to add insult, the planes failed to recover as well. So coming into the final turn, the Chinese are still in control of more than 2 hexes, so they're winning, but the balance may be shifting. So in the special operations phase, the Chinese played Cyber Strike. This is something they played last turn to come into effect this turn. That will lower the anti-missile defense scores of American units with this green area missile defense. That's now a 10 on both the destroyers. So their defences just got compromised by this cyber attack, and also the anti-ship scores of these destroyers is dropped to 2 for the turn, and this is the final turn of the game. So that's going to make them easier to hit and give them less punch. The Americans played their US Navy SEALs in the hope of special forces coming in and doing a damage to one of these units. Unfortunately, they need either an air unit or a submarine unit, a US air or submarine unit, to play that, and they no longer have an air or submarine unit which could deliver the Navy SEALs to their target. So I think that goes back in the tray unused, and we will get some moves in. So it's sort of come down to this, a punching match between 2 remaining task forces. On the First Island Coalition side, we have a destroyer with its values lowered by 1, 2 missile boats, a frigate and a carrier with no planes. And on the Chinese side, we have a destroyer and 2 frigates and a carrier with planes, but which it can't seem to refit. Maybe they're waiting for supplies. So it doesn't really matter who gets to define the engagement, because whoever does is firing at the other group. There is also a Chinese submarine in here to launch a surprise attack. So I suppose if the Chinese win the initiative roll, then they get to define the engagement, and that would give this sub a surprise attack. Whereas if the Americans and First Island and Vietnamese win, then the sub would not get the surprise attack in the order of play. It would have to wait till right at the end of the engagement phase. So submarines are strange like that, in that they can be great if you have the initiative, but not so good if you are reacting to the opponent. So here we go. Let's give it a a role, and the Chinese have won 5-4, so they will get to define this engagement, and they will get to make that surprise attack. So if we run through the engagement in full, if they had their aircraft recovered, then they would trace a strike path in, resolve any anti-air and air-to-air combat, of which there wouldn't be any air-to-air, but there would be anti-air, and then they could make an attack with the aircraft, which would be nice, but they don't have that option right now. They do get to make a submarine surprise attack, as we've already mentioned, so there's subs in here with a torpedo value of 3, almost undoubtedly, there it is. Will make a surprise attack on the destroyers that are defending this task force, and if they can sink those, that just drops the defence of everything massively, so that would be a huge bonus. So they've got 2 dice plus 3. They get a 6 plus 3 is 9, and that's 1 more than they needed, so they cause 1 step loss. They don't manage to sink the destroyers, so step loss over here on these boat destroyers, but they still have their anti-missile defence value, I believe. I'll check that that's whether that's affected by step losses, but I don't remember anything saying that it was. Well, these 2 task forces are trading blows, and we've just had what's probably the decisive round of combat. The Chinese recovered their planes, but they couldn't hit anything. But then there was a trade of shots, and the Chinese and American groups both destroyed each other's remaining destroyers, and that left their remaining ships with none of the area missile cover. And the Chinese frigates just slightly outgunned the frigates and motorboats that were left. So the First Island Coalition remaining forces are a carrier with no planes, a damaged missile boat, sorry, not motorboat, missile unit, boat unit, an undamaged missile boat unit. You can see they've got missile defence of 7, which is pretty poor, and they've only got an anti-ship, surface-to-surface anti-ship attack of 1, and they are facing off against 2 of these Chinese frigates, which have a 9 missile defence and an anti-ship of 3. So these guys are hitting on 5s, whereas the Vietnamese missile boats are hitting on what will they need to hit 9s? 8s, no, 9s. So there's a large percentage difference, and the planes have recovered again, so there's going to be some fighters coming in next round as well. So the American First Island chain group might as well stand and fight, because if they could reduce the Chinese to just 1 unit, then they couldn't hold 2 hexes, but I think that's unlikely. So let's just see how it goes for these last few turns. We're moving into cycle 4. So what's going to happen here? Well, for this group, they're just going to remove the out of element marker because they all moved and they're ocean going, so that's their move done. And here, this damaged submarine group, it wants to try and control the hex, so it wants to stay out of range, so they will now retreat back up here. And on this side, the Nimitz has to take its out of element marker off. And there's no point retreating these, they may as well just continue firing or get blown up or whatever. So that's it for the moves. Let's make an initiative roll to see who will fire first, although who gets to define the initial engagement? It's the Chinese anyway. Although this game is one of the things that was baffling me when I started playing this game, and I'll just highlight this now, is that because firing goes in the order of stealth scores, and then if they're equal in anti-ship for, say, surface combat, and if they're equal then it's simultaneous. Often defining an engagement isn't that valuable. It's valuable if you have submarines that can take the initiative. But for example, if the Americans had won this and said, okay, well, our Task Force 1 will engage this Task Force, they'd still be firing second. The frigates would still be firing first. The aircraft would still come in and attack them before they had a chance to fire. So you can define really disadvantageous engagements and get all your stuff blown up before it gets to shoot, which is unusual in a war game, but it is possible and very easy to do here, in fact, and just one of those little quirks of how everything gets timed. But I really like it. I do really like that facet of it, that you can have that disadvantage and you can't overcome it just by rolling a good initiative roll. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, it's the last hurrah for a couple of Vietnamese missile boats, I think, in this scenario. And indeed, 2 dice rolls, and it was all over. The fighters came in, and that was the end of one lot of missile boats, and the frigates opened fire, and that was the end of the other lot of missile boats. And there's a Nimitz-class cruiser, aircraft carrier left in there, and I could shoot at it with some frigates and it could run away and blah-de-blah-de-blah, but it doesn't have any attacking potential. It's got no weapons on it apart from anti-submarine. There's really no point, because it can't keep up with the submarine anyway, because it's got, and it's only got two turns to try and get across to the submarine. It wouldn't make it, and the submarine could move anyway. Well, it could come. Anyway, it's all an irrelevance. If the Nimitz wanted to try and hunt that submarine, it could, but it's just going to get blown out of the water by some aircraft and a couple of frigates. This is a Chinese win. They are going to control 2 hexes in the Spratlys at the end of the game, and there's nothing the First Island Coalition can do about it with an empty aircraft carrier. Yeah, interesting. Really, really interesting system. I think it's actually quite brutal, and in that sense, quite evocative of I think of modern combat. There's no quarter given. Things just disappear off the board. Missiles get launched, they hit, stuff is gone. It really is that straightforward and that brutal. I'm probably going to just move away from this for a little while, but we'll come back to this because it's very easy to set up and play, and I want to have a look at some of the additional scenarios that were posted on Board Game Geek and see what the campaign game looks like as well.